the Canadian Prime Minister was assisted by over cabinet, and James Buchanan, who arguably set off the American Civil War. All good names for a bit. Slightly better ones, John McDonald and Alexander Mackenzie, the first executive prime minister of Canada, and James Madison, the architect of the United States Constitution. Also, by the way, I want to apologize to the group as a whole. I thought Canadians cared about governors general, and I included them to make sure that Andrew didn't complain that Canada was only getting half the time of everyone else. And it turns out, no, I can enter their full names into Google and not have it prompt me anything about that. So, sorry about that. They're just kind of cluttering up the answers, but Theodore Roosevelt, Russell. Apologies to the American, there's no American president with S. Smith is good enough, you bastard. Taylor and Tyler Thompson. By the way, John Tyler came up again in the news recently. I don't know if you heard. So we're going to start a fair bit away from why Tyler is in the news, but we'll get there, I promise. Tyler was president of the United States from 1841 to 1845. While he was president, the United States launched its new steamship, the SS Princeton, and Tyler was so proud of it, he insisted that it take its maiden voyage up and down the Potomac, and he invited 600 people to board the ship and launch. And in a way that is kind of reminiscent of an earlier story from this evening, the visitors insisted that the crew fire the main guns several times to their delight. And on the fourth time, the guns exploded, killing 6 people, including Secretary of State Upshur, Secretary of the Navy Gilmore, and most importantly, New York lawyer David Gardner. This is most important to our story. And the reason this is important is because most of the visitors, including Gardner's daughter Julia, were downstairs on the ship and unaffected. But Julia, upon hearing that her father had been killed, fainted dead away. And President Tyler personally carried her to safety. And 6 months later, they were married, despite a 40-year age difference. Gardner and Tyler had 4 children, the second of which was Lion Gardner Tyler, shown here in these robes because he was the president of the College of William and Mary. And he took after his father, marrying a woman 30 years his junior and having several children. The middle one of which was Harrison Ruffin Tyler, who passed away just 2 months ago. Which means up until 2 months ago, the man who annexed Texas into the United States had a living grandson. All right. 19, oh, you're right, Taft should be in there. I am so sorry. All right. First name starting with B.
That's more than 0.
Starting with B, the Babine and the Brandywine. the way, Andrew and Sarah, I do not recommend you name your child after this river because people will think you are just pretentiously spelling Maurice. I would also like to point out that I am reasonably sure that Andrew has been sitting there silently disdaining every name that I have suggested until I said rock drumming, at which point he said, oh, that might work. And then it's... And then T. All right. A warning before we jump into these. Failures are always more interesting than successes, so I've got a fair number of derails here, all right? So B includes the Cleveland Barons, the Boston Braves, who were the Boston Bees for 4 years. The Blackhawks technically changed their name by removing the space between Black and Hold on. NBA had a Blackhawks as well, which is defunct. So, there. Continuing on, the Charlotte Bobcats, Boston Colonels, the St. Louis Bombers. So there are 2 teams on here. Bristol Rovers. Go back. Circle it. There you go. All right. 2 teams on here I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about the St. Louis Browns. So if you're not familiar with them, the St. Louis Browns were in St. Louis from 1902 to 1953. That is a little bit of a lie. The St. Louis Browns actually existed in St. Louis before 1902, but in 1901 they changed their names to the St. Louis Cardinals, which you're more familiar with, and then the Milwaukee Brewers moved to St. Louis and changed their name to the Browns, which is kind of weird. But what's important is St. Louis had 2 baseball teams, and by the late 1940s it was very clear that St. Louis could not support 2 baseball teams. Enter Bill Veeck. Some of you are laughing already. Bill Veeck was one of the most flamboyant owners in all of sports. He bought the St. Louis Browns in the hopes of outdoing the St. Louis Cardinals and keeping the Browns in St. Louis. He knew he couldn't do it by putting together a good team, so he did it with massive publicity, including hiring a little person to be a pitch hitter who had a 2-inch strike zone and was fired personally by the president of the American League the next day for damaging the reputation of the sport. He gave out cards to people to hold up and held a crowd management day where the crowd could vote on whether the pitcher would throw strikes or balls, or whether the batter would swing or steal or bunt. He hired Satchel Paige to the St. Louis Browns, which doesn't sound like a stunt because Satchel Paige was one of the most amazing pitchers of the Negro Leagues until you realize that Satchel Paige was 45 years old at the time that Veeck hired him. With all of this... What? Yeah, whatever. Anyway, point being, the St. Louis Browns sucked, but they were fun. And they started, 2 other things he did. Specifically to bring in St. Louis Cardinals fans, he hired 2 stars from the St. Louis Cardinals, Dizzy Dean to be the Browns announcer, and Roger Hornsby to be their manager, to pull in Cardinals fans. And as a result, the Browns sucked, but they were fun to watch. The Cardinals were good and dry as hell. And it looked like St. Louis, the Cardinals, were going to be the ones to lead. Especially when the Cardinals owner, Fred Sy, was arrested for income tax evasion and jailed for 18 months. And Major League Baseball didn't really like the idea of one of the owners being in jail, so they leaned on Cy to sell the team. Everyone assumed a Cy would sell the team to one of the outside people who was looking to move the team, but in fact he sold it to Anheuser-Busch for less than he could have gotten from anyone else. But Anheuser-Busch promised to keep the Cardinals in St. Louis. And that's when Veeck knew he was defeated. He couldn't possibly compete with Anheuser-Busch's pockets to keep the Browns in. So he called Mayor Tommy D'Alessandro of Baltimore, and the team moved to Baltimore to become the Orioles. And if you're from Cleveland and having a little bit of PTSD, all right, other team I'm going to talk about are the Breckenridge. Because what the hell is a Breckenridge? Well, the answer is John Cable Breckenridge was seen as a political wonderkind from Kentucky. He was one of the youngest people in Congress. He was elected to the vice presidency of the United States at the age of 36. It was assumed he would be a political voice that would dominate most of the latter half of the 19th century. Except he was elected vice president to this guy, you may remember I said arguably started the Civil War. Breckenridge then ran for president in 1860 on the I like slavery, let's make it as much as possible ticket. He got him all of the South, but lost the race to Abraham Lincoln. With the country splitting apart in the Civil War, and with Breckenridge already being an outspoken pro-slavery guy, he did the thing you'd expect. He joined the Confederacy and was named general. But it turned out that bad-handling people and congressional politics is nothing compared to being a general, and nothing compared to dealing with army politics. And Breckenridge was both a failure as a general and also blamed by his superiors for his superiors' mistakes, and ended up fleeing the Confederacy before the war was over and never entering politics again. And if you'd like a little bit of schadenfreude about a team that was named after someone so aggressively pro-slavery, you should know that the Breckenridges were in the Football League for 3 years and then 1 year as the Colonels, and during that time they won one game, which was the only game they scored points in. All right, moving on to M. The Mighty Ducks changed their names to just Ducks in 2006. You can mock them for that, but they also won the Cup that year, so I guess it worked. By the way, as we move forward to ours, I should point out that the Minneapolis Marines in 1928 changed their name to the Red Jackets, and then they also went out of business. So either one would count. I guess congratulations, if you know Minnesota football, you might have gotten 2 answers. Other interesting note, the Redlegs. So in 1953, the Cincinnati Reds realized it was the height of McCarthyism, and they were called the Reds. And so they said, no, we used to be the Red Stockings, call us the Redlegs. And they did that for 6 years until the coast was clear and changed their name back to the Cincinnati Reds. Also have the Robins, which was one who came to the Brooklyn Dodgers. For S, the Portsmouth Spartans who moved to Detroit and became the Detroit Tigers.
Cleveland Spiders are too old.
The Decatur Staleys, named after the Staley Food Corporation, who in 1921 moved to Chicago and renamed themselves the Bears. You might have heard of that. But the team on here I most want to talk about and you most want to hear about are the Steagles. Okay, So 1943, there aren't a lot of young men to play professional sports. Most of them are off raising flags over Iwo Jima. I know that's 1945. I realize making that mistake in front of the war gamers in here is troublesome, but it's a metaphor. Keep with it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said that the United States should keep up its sports teams for morale, but the problem was 600 players in the NFL left the NFL in 1943 to join the Army. As a result, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Philadelphia Eagles, between the two of them, had 22 players. And so Art Rooney reached out to the owner of the Eagles and said, why don't we merge the teams for 1 year? The end result was what was officially called the Eagles-Steelers Combine, but everyone called the Steagles. They had a very respectable year, and the next year, there were enough players in the NFL to field 11 teams. But if you've ever done scheduling, 11 is an insanely hard number of teams to schedule against each other. So the NFL asked if Philadelphia and Pittsburgh would combine again to get it down to 10 teams. Philadelphia said sure, but the Steelers said, nah, we've had enough of this. And as a result, Philadelphia was merged with the Chicago Cardinals, who would also be on this list if C was a letter. They became Card Pit for a year, which all the sports writers called Carpet because every other team walked all over them. They had a 0-10 year and were outscored by their opponents 3-1. All right, moving forward with T. And I can't leave this category. I can't leave this category without bringing up one team that isn't on the list due to letters, and that is the Tonawanda Cardex. Fans, that's so awesome. Tonawanda, if you're not familiar with it, is a town just a little bit upstream, downstream, I'm not sure, stream away from Niagara Falls. Downstream, thank you. You guys fight about it. I don't care. I've got more things to say. Anyways, Tonawanda, the Tonawanda Cardex, named after a local industry that sponsored, or a local office supply store that sponsored them, played in the New York Professional League and on the Tonawanda High School football field. In 1921, they were asked, or they were invited to join the NFL, but they had 3 hurdles. The first was the oops, that's the wrong button again. There we go. The first was the serious amount of paperwork they were asked to fill out. The second was the $50 payment fee they had to give to join the NFL. These guys were semi-professional. $50 was a lot in 21. But the biggest hurdle was playing other teams. You see, in 1921, the NFL was mostly Midwestern. Tonawanda was declared a traveling team because they didn't have a sufficient stadium for the NFL standards, so they were playing all their games as away games, and 80% of the teams were 200 miles or more away, which is a long way to go in 1921 on a train when you have to be at work on Monday. And so the Tonawanda Cardex played their only game against the Rochester Jeffs. It happened, I swear, where they got their asses kicked 0-55. So they were starting to think that maybe the NFL wasn't for them when the NFL declared in 1922 that the new fee for franchises was $1,000. The Cardex said, we are noping out of this, and went back to the New York League. But that does mean, across the 105 years of NFL history, the Tonawanda Cardex officially have a 0-1 record, which makes them the shortest-lived NFL team in history and potentially the shortest-lived professional team in all of sports. And I will also say that if you say Tonawanda Cardex enough times, those no longer sound like English words.
All right, just a reminder, if you haven't already, please flip over your sheet. Vote for a name based on everything you've heard. One more. I haven't gotten to dogs yet. We're getting there. Trust me. All right? Most popular dog names. What? No. Circle it. I will point out, just one last thing to point out, this is the last little bit. If you have not voted for anything already for a baby name, I will point out that Shadow is one of the potential answers for the quiz. And then T. And with that, we want to thank the whole crowd. Thank you all so very much for being here. Please gather your sheets, leave them on the table, or hand them to an AGM. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much. I can't bow any further. My back hurts too much. Thank you, guys.